He told almost no one what he planned to do. When you were the kind of wealthy that had become a public record, magazine profiles, speaking slots, a Wikipedia page edited by strangers, privacy was not an absence of attention, but something you paid for like anything else. Graham Locke, 44, American, born in Indiana, made in Seattle, moved through the world with the deliberate economy of a former collegiate runner who had settled into a narrower strength. He was tall without being imposing, long-limbed, with a runner's calm and the soft gray at his temples that made undergraduates in lecture halls trust him when he guest taught at the university. The internet liked to call him a tech millionaire, which was both lazy and accurate. He had co-founded a logistics software company at 29, exited at 36, then spent a number of loudly documented years investing in responsible ventures and quietly funding search and rescue teams in the Cascades because he knew the feeling of running out of angles on a ridgeline with fog at your knees. In the spring, when he turned 44, he set himself a private challenge. 7 days. No phone, no satellite communicator, no scheduled check-ins beyond a single prearranged pickup at the end. One island. Make camp. Find water. Fish. Wait out weather. Walk the perimeter. Return with nothing but photographs in his head and a notebook full of self-respect. It was not a test he needed to pass for anyone else. It felt closer to an audit of the promises he had made to himself when he still thought life went on forever in a straight line. He could have chosen the San Juan Islands or something in the Gulf of Alaska, where he sometimes went to see how the sea looked when it remembered it could kill. Instead, he chose a place he had never seen but knew by reputation: Mona Island, Puerto Rico. A limestone plateau thrown into the Mona Passage like a shoulder, no permanent settlements, feral goats, cactus, caves, a ruined lighthouse, and water so turquoise it looked engineered. Federal and territorial protection meant permits, but that was part of the appeal. You had to want to be there on purpose. The U.S. Coast Guard ran patrols out of Aguadilla. Rangers came and went. People visited for a day. Few stayed the night. Life grew in hollows and on ledges. There was enough nothing for him to practice being alone. He flew into San Juan, bought a machete and a bundle of paracord at a hardware store that sold everything and nothing he recognized, and drove west in a rented Jeep listening to the road talk back. In Aguadilla, he met a charter captain with a cautious friendliness and a scar on one forearm shaped like a map of a place you should not return to. They loaded his gear: a tarp, a bivvy, a pot, a water filter, a ferro rod, a knife, line, hooks, a first aid kit, a small notebook bound in waxed linen, a pencil, a single printed chart marked with an X for the protected cove where the captain would drop him, and, if his tiny contract with himself held, pick him up in 7 days. The captain tapped the X with a nail. Playa Sardinera. Good anchorage if wind is from east. If it is not, I make a different choice. He didn't smile when he said it. No phone. No phone, Graham said. That's the rule. He could have said more, that he trusted the worst parts of himself less when they were comforted by the best parts of machines. But the captain had the look of someone who didn't need to be convinced. They left at dawn. Coqui frogs fell to silence as they pushed off. In the hour after sunrise, the Mona Passage was as polite as it ever got. Short swell, a clean wind, the boat cutting a line between blues until the island rose flat-topped ahead, white cliffs like a line of teeth at the water. As they rounded into the lee, the water softened to a sheet, and the cove opened like a promise someone might break. 7 days. The captain said on the last float of the engine's idle. I come at noon. If weather is bad, later. If weather is bad and keeps being bad, I call Coast Guard and they get angry at me and then with you. It sounded like a story from his own life, and Graham nodded because speech felt like bringing too many things into the boat. He stepped off into water to his thighs, shouldered the pack, and felt the weight as the purest thing in the morning. The beach was a thumb of sand held between limestone tongues. Baragon fig trees hunched low above the line of wreck. Beyond them, the scrub rose to a plateau half green, half thorn. A ranger sign warned in weathered Spanish and English that everything here, plants, animals, stones, was protected by laws that did not care about your plans. He set the pack on dry sand, took off his shoes, and felt the warmth catch in the thin skin of his feet, a small announcement that he was here. He walked the cove and made a map in his head. The creek that was only a creek in the wet season. The wash of shells under the ledge that would rattle and announce any walking thing at night. A flat place to lay a tarp where the wind would keep the insects uncertain. He listened for more than wind and heard only wind and the slow conversation of small waves with stone. He walked inland 50 yards to see what the scrub held and saw the roofline before the wall. An old wooden shack tucked back under a gumbalimbo tree, gray boards, one wall half swallowed by a strand of climbing cactus, the kind of small structure you find on an island that has been used and left by a series of plants. He paused with the politeness he had learned in cities where knocking on a door meant safety and an answer. He went to the door anyway because the air had changed temperature by 2 degrees, and, with it, the structure of his plans. Shade makes promises in a place like that. The door was driftwood strapped to hinges with sheet metal. He pushed. The wood breathed the way longwood does, and then let him in. At first glance, the shack was exactly what it would have been when it was built by someone who wanted to stay dry long enough to sleep. 4 walls, a low ceiling, a table as soft as cardboard, a case of empty glass bottles mislabeled as useful. It took his eyes a long breath to find the other thing, and when he did, the names for it did not come at once. Bones, yes, human, not scattered by animals or weather, not the collapse of time on accident. Arranged. Across the packed sand floor extended a symbol as precise as it was irrational. A compass rose formed with radiating spokes of long bones tied at the hub with fishing line, vertebrae making neat rings between the spokes, smaller bones set like tick marks at tidy intervals. For skulls, only 4, sat at the cardinal points facing inward, the mandibles wired so the heads would not fall apart. Around the assemblage lay a circle of shells, all the same species, all with their apertures turned toward the center. The room smelled not of old death, but of salt and fish oil, as if someone had treated the past with a coat of the present. He did not speak. The body keeps your quieter promises when it wants to live. He backed out once, then in again, because removing sight does not remove fact. He noted the absence of the obvious. No clothes, no personal effects, no obvious tool marks. He noted the presence of the non-obvious. A small braid of line fixed at the window frame, 6 strands woven into a pattern that suggested time and choice. His breath made hoarse trouble in his throat, and he believed, for a moment, that if he breathed too hard the bones would lose their arrangement, and then he would have to name something as clumsy as desecration. He stepped back from the threshold and studied the beach like it belonged to a different day. He ate because eating is sometimes an agreement with the part of you that wants to keep the promise of return. He boiled water in the small pot to be doing a thing his hands could do while the other part of his head proposed plans. Leave. There was nowhere to go that did not involve water too far to swim. The boat would not be back for 6 days. He could make a camp on the beach and keep away from the shack. But the beach was a stage with no curtain, and the shack, bones or not, was shelter when the sky did what it could do in the tropics without asking permission. At dusk, the first storm scouts arrived, wind turning a direction, clouds folding into themselves. He strung his tarp low and angled, built a bed of leaves under it that would do nothing and everything, and stacked dry wood in case the rain had an intermission. The shack sat there as one more shape among shapes. He told himself he would sleep outside and use the shack as a thing to be carefully ignored. Night on an island you do not know encourages your head to write plays and cast every small noise as the lead. Geckos ticked along wood. Hermit crabs knocked shells against other shells in negotiations that had been taking place for 3 million years. The wind turned so the sea became louder and felt closer, and under the wind he heard the shape of voices and then the absence of voices. Around 11 he saw a small light near the strand of trees. Yellow, not white, a candlelight color. Move once and then vanish as cleanly as a child concealing a firefly in her hands. At midnight the rain came. Fat drops first, then the smaller kind that feels like a decision. He lasted an hour under the tarp before the one of walls won. And he stood, took the tarp off its stakes like a man folding a flag, and went into the shack because all the ethics in the world do not make you less of an animal when you are wet. He did not step in the compass. He stood with his back to the wall and let the room define the outlines of his body. He slept, he dreamed lightly. He woke several times to the room breathing with the wind and, once, to a sound like a palm touched to the outside wall and lifted again. He convinced himself geckos had learned percussion. Light at the gray edge of day made the world honest again. He stepped out into a morning that smelled rinsed and new and saw what rain can hold while it is falling and then return. Prints. Not goat hooves, not iguana, not heavy birds, or not only those. Human footprints. Dozens, perhaps more. Barefoot, varied in size, some small enough that child occurred to him before he could forbid it, some broad and adult, some with toes splayed by age or barefoot life, some narrow, deliberate, like someone who knows they are seen by the ground. They ringed the shack and crossed the beach and stopped at the rack line, and returned and crossed and recrossed. At the edge of the cove where the limestone made steps down to water, a neat stack of 3 identical stones stood like an argument shaped into a pillar. We were here because we decided to be. He walked the perimeter because understanding is sometimes an act of lifting your feet until they choose to put themselves down again. He found no cigarette ends, no plastic wrappers, no bottle caps, none of the artifacts of the kind of human presence that had made him rich building software that shuttled disposable things toward doors. He found a length of braided fishing line hanging from a low branch, with shells woven into it like punctuation marks. He found the soft-edged impression of a heel in a pocket of limestone dust under the gumbalimbo tree. He found a rounded piece of driftwood carved with a symbol that echoed the shape in the shack. A simple compass rose, 8 points, the lines so shallow they might have been worn by a fingernail. He sat on the sand and let the information arrange itself. He made a new plan. Water first, always water. The limestone of Mona held depressions and holes called guacaras by people who named things before maps. He walked north, gently uphill, following the soundlessness of cactus and thorn. The plateau in places went sharp with karst, pockmarked, as if the surface of an ancient bone had been magnified. He found a shallow sink where humidity gathered and a drip fed a tea-colored puddle that would clog any filter with patience. He filtered anyway. He set a tarp between 2 palms as a rain catch. He returned to the beach by a different line and saw, across the cove, a figure move for the first time in his field of view not as a thought, but as mass. It was too far for detail, too quick to count, and he told himself it was a goat, or an iguana, or a thing the light had invented. He fished at dusk because in places like this fish volunteer themselves at day's edges. He caught one, silver, small, and notched it on a stick like a new scout and cooked it over coals because that is what the body wanted more than explanations. He drank water that tasted like the inside of a cave. He made a path with his feet between the shack and his tarp that did not cross the compass rose because refraining became a liturgy. He slept better on the second night until he didn't. At 3 in the morning, he woke to a sound like a hand brushing sand. He turned on his small headlamp and swept the beam and saw sand. He turned the light off again because harboring the dark felt like an act of respect. The sound returned once, then not again, and he slept because the body will not accept every invitation to become a nerve. On the third day, he walked farther. Inland, the plateau opened to a place where the world under his feet had fallen in. Limestone collapsed into swallow holes as clean-edged as a bowl cut from rock. He looked down into one and saw a floor of green at the bottom where sun collected and plants took the light like a dare. In another he saw only water, still as fresh paint, blue as an apology. He circled to the lighthouse on Mona's east end, Faro de Mona, a cylinder of ruin white against white sky, built by men with a different idea of how to mark a place. In the rooms at its base, he found graffiti decades old and newer, names in Spanish and English, and none of those. He found charcoal and the cold, old smell of human sleep. On a ledge shaped like a table, he found a coil of nylon rope and a cleat torn from a small boat. He tried to imagine a story that involved them and resolved to skip the middle where it all went wrong. Returning to the cove by the long north path, he cut his arm on a thorn he should have seen and bandaged it with the half-pride of someone who can still do a thing without asking. On the beach, he found a new cairn at the rack line. This one taller, perhaps 5 stones, the topmost small and flat. Beside it lay a piece of driftwood with the compass rose symbol cut again, deeper now, the points better defined. For the first time he felt the sensation he always had mocked when he read about it, being watched, because if someone had placed this to be seen, then seeing it was an act of collaboration. He spoke aloud in the empty cove. "I'm leaving in 4 days," he said to air and sea and wood and stones. "I will not touch your things. I will not touch the bones. I will leave nothing behind that you would not want to find." He did not know who the "you" was in the sentence and did not ask his mind to answer. That night he moved his tarp so the shack did not sit in his peripheral like a person at the door. He built his bed higher to decouple his back from the crawl of sand. A wind came in off the water and wrote sentences on the tarp that made sleep feel like a messy classroom. At midnight, the small yellow light appeared again near the trees, moved with the deliberation of a flame shielded by a hand, then went out as if snuffed by breath. He lay very still and discovered the precise limits of stillness. On the 4th day, the heat came like a delivered bill. Even the iguanas moved with accounting. He rehung the rain catch and built a solar still for the practice of pretending you can bargain with a star. He gathered prickly pear pads with the slow carefulness of someone who has learned how to talk to a cactus with a knife. He saw feral goats for the first time up close, gray, ragged, eyes that considered him without flinching and then decided no and departed. He saw, in the dust under a ledge, bare human footprints again, and this time could not explain them as old because the wind had been at work all night erasing, and yet these were clean as a wrong turn. He went to the shack in daylight for the first time since the first morning and looked in because avoiding becomes a way of binding yourself to the avoided. The compass rows of bones remained as it had been. The small braid of line at the window had acquired a new knot, a loop tucked back into itself in a way that suggested a lesson he had not attended. On the table lay a fish spine arranged to echo the compass in miniature, a performance of idea in a new material. He stood with his hands open at his sides to show the room he was not there to move anything and backed out, because faith requires behaviors whether you have faith or not. He wrote in the notebook in the evening while the sky practiced being dramatic. Day 4. Prints again. New cairn. Carved token. Fish spine pattern left in shack. Someone entered while I was gone. No signs of boats in cove. If living group, why no trash? If ritual, why here? He drew the compass rose from memory and numbered the skulls because the act of numbering makes you feel like you can count to the end of things. On the 5th day, rain came in hard. A rope of water that lasted 2 hours and rewrote the beach so that no prince lived, and the ash of his last night's fire spread into a gray map without countries. For the first time since he arrived, he found comfort in a downpour because it made control visible, water as the only authority that answered to nothing local. He filled bottles and set them in a line like soldiers willing to obey the cold. He ate the last of the fish, a handful of raw cholla buds, some sea grape leaves the book had said were edible. He let his head be a place boats could cross and did not launch any. Late in the afternoon, when the rain moved on reluctantly, he walked to the far end of the cove and saw, across the water, a figure at the edge of the trees watching him. He raised a hand because being from the place he was from had taught him that raising a hand meant hello, not surrender. The figure raised a hand in return, held it, then turned away and was no longer a figure because trees can be people until you look too hard, and they have the good manners to go back to being trees. He stood for a long time with both hands at his sides and felt the attention on his spine like a breeze under a door. He slept with the knife in the sleeping bag's foot for the first time on the island and did not consider the contradiction of calling this survival when all his surviving depended now on the goodwill of a stranger who would bring a boat because he had been paid to do so. On the 6th day, he set himself the job of walking the full shoreline that the cove allowed without committing to a swim no one would write you a map to. He passed under shells where swallows had mudded their nests into small amphitheaters. He stepped through a field of bleached goat bones arranged by wind and not by idea. He reached a point where the limestone became a series of shoulders and looked down into water so clear the parrotfish looked like someone's painted acquaintance. On a flat slab of limestone above a particularly blue pool, he hauled a piece of driftwood and wrote SOS with limestone powder, filling the letters until they felt like a word loud enough to shout at a sky. In the lighthouse again, he found a new thing that made him uncertain. A small cook fire laid in a ring of stones but not lit, with a matchbox set inside like a note. He touched nothing. He said, "I don't need it," into a room that had not asked him anything. In late afternoon, a light that has the fatigue of a promise kept, he stood on the beach and saw a boat far out across the passage, too far to be his, running east. He raised both arms and laughed at himself for raising both arms when the boat was a dot and the dot, soon, a nothing. He walked back to the shack and saw, without surprise and without the grace of a surprise's utility, that the fish spine pattern on the table had been rearranged into a new geometry. No longer the compass, now a spiral, tight at the center and easing at the edge, an old sign wearing a new idea. On the floor, the compass of bones remained true to itself except for one small addition. On the hub of tied long bones, someone had braided a ring of palm fiber and set it like a crown. That night wind came from 2 directions and made arguments across the ridge. He lay with his eyes open and listened to the shack translate. He heard footsteps in sand outside and did not look because he did not trust his head to keep the count of footsteps, and if he did not count them, he could not set the number down beside any other number later. He woke at 4 to silence again, and this time a silence that felt added rather than revealed. On the morning of the 7th day, he took everything down and put everything up. He broke the bed he had built, not because law required it, but because leaving a bed for someone you do not know feels too much like assuming they will sleep. He packed the tarp and the rope in the pot and the notebook and the small carved token he had told himself he would not keep, and then rationalized as evidence of a thing he could not prove to himself without touching. He left the shack as he had found it except for whatever his presence had done to the air. At 10 o'clock, he built a small signal fire at the edge of the cove, where the wind would carry smoke before the rain had any thoughts. At 11 o'clock, he walked the cliff line to watch water. At 11:30, he saw nothing but water. At 12:15, he declared to no one that he would wait until 2 o'clock to say the boat was late. At 12:40, he heard an engine, first a vibration, then a sound, and by 12:50, he saw a white hull with a red stripe and the letters that tell a person who they must become when they speak. USG, cut into the cove. The charter captain stood on the bow, shoulders higher than on the morning 7 days ago, and behind him a Coast Guard petty officer with a face that said he had done this before, but not with a man like this in a place like this. "You're late," Graham said when they were near enough to make tone a thing that could travel. "Weather," the captain said. "And a call." He pointed to the side of his own face where a phone would be if phones were allowed in plans. "Your friends called my phone when you didn't answer yours." I said there was no phone. They said that was the problem. He didn't smile. The petty officer did. Graham told them before they asked. "There's a structure on the cove," he said. "An old shack. Inside." He stopped because you edit yourself when you want to be believed. "Inside there is an arrangement of human bones. A symbol. For skulls. Long bones tied into a compass. And there are people here. They came at night. I saw lights. I saw footprints every morning. I think they watched me." The petty officer did what training does to a face. "We'll take a look," he said. "Do you need medical?" "I need water and something that tastes like it came from a place that is not this place." It came out more bitter than he meant. The petty officer nodded toward a bottle in a crate. Graham drank and felt his head return from a place slightly left of where it had been living. "Your pickup was scheduled?" the officer said. "Yes. Today at noon. No comms before. That was the point." "Okay," the officer said. "We'll log your statement in Aguadilla and then come back tomorrow with a team. If there are remains, they will be treated as crime scene material. If there are people," he left the sentence open. The boat quartered out of the cove and turned into the chop of the passage. Mona fell behind the stern a little at a time, the island holding its horizontal line like a conspiracy between sea and limestone to make edges look gentler than they are. At Aguadilla, the statement took 2 hours because the form had been written for other things, and men like the petty officer had learned how to make forms into nets that could sometimes catch truth. Graham described the compass of bones and the line braided at the window and the carved driftwood with the symbol. He described the footprints and the light and his refusal to put into words the shape he sometimes felt outside the tarp at 3 in the morning. He described the small fish spine pattern on the table and the new crown on the hub of long bones and the sound of a hand on a wall that he had decided would be geckos no matter what. The officer wrote carefully and then read the words back because he understood dignity as the last tool on a bad shelf. "We'll go out tomorrow at daylight with Puerto Rico Police Bureau and Natural Resources," he said. "If there are remains, we'll secure them. You should rest and eat and decide which parts of this you need to tell people who will decide things about you for a while." Graham slept the way people sleep when the air has forgotten their name. He woke twice to nothing and once to the particular silence of a conditioned room and laughed, because sometimes the body makes jokes to rebuild dignity. In the morning, the Coast Guard went back. The petty officer radioed from the cove in a voice that had decided not to show anyone what the man felt. "We are at Playa Sardinera," he said. "Shack is as described. Entering. A minute, 2, then, negative on remains." Another voice, a ranger's, cut in gentle as a firm hand. There is a table. There is a braid on a window. There is a circle of shells on the floor, random. No bones. No skulls. No symbol. No recent prints outside. Some goat prints. No human. No cairn. The officer called Graham from the dock. "We found the structure," he said. "We found your fire pit, your bed sign under the palm, but nothing else." He let the sentence sit in the air long enough for all the interpretations to gather around it, then sighed. "Night gives itself different names in places like that," he said, not unkind. "It doesn't mean you didn't see what you saw." Graham walked to the edge of the harbor where boats say what they think in the language foam uses. He looked at the water and saw in it every surface he had trusted too much. He did not argue with a man whose job was to own the next hour. He flew back to the mainland because staying would have become a performance for strangers who would never see what he had seen. In the first week home, he answered 3 calls from a magazine and let 6 others go unanswered because only one of the calls contained a question that was not a knife. He opened the notebook and copied the compass rose drawing into a new page and wrote under it. Without intending to, they knew the shape of my attention. He turned the carved driftwood token in his hand, the points shallow, the center smooth, and did not know whether the guilt he felt belonged to theft or superstition or the simple sin of making a story into something he could carry. The official report, when it came a month later as a PDF with polite borders, was professional and blank of heat. It described a search of the cove and vicinity. It inventoried a structure in disrepair with no evidence of human remains. It noted multiple goat trails, feral goat droppings, iguana burrows. It listed the presence of empty glass bottles, a notched stick, a cooking site, a set of footprints consistent with a single adult male, likely the reporting party. It noted no criminal findings. The word delusional did not appear, neither did the word wrong. The Coast Guard's internal memo added that the charter captain had been in good standing for 20 years and had, upon return to harbor, provided a statement consistent with the arranged plan. The memo recommended the case be closed unless new evidence emerged. A week after he arrived home, a small padded envelope reached him without a return address. Inside lay a braid of fishing line with shells woven into it in the same pattern he had found at the cove. There was no note. He checked the postmark and found a smear with no city readable and a date 1 day after the Coast Guard had made their report. He told himself that anyone who knew his name could find his address in 3 phone calls, that people mailed worse things for sport, that coincidences were the mathematics of people who needed them. He placed the braid in a drawer and closed the drawer, and once closed, the drawer became a place where the braid might not be while he did other work. At night, sometimes, he woke to the sound a hand makes brushing a wall lightly and lifting again. He stood in the doorway between his bedroom and the hall and told himself the building creaked with weather and age and the neighbor's antibiotic washing machine and the physics of aquarium plumbing. He knew all the correct phrases. He knew how to be the man who had never believed in anything but systems and penalties. On a Sunday afternoon, he drove to the coast north of the city where the Pacific does its gray, gentle impression and walked down to the line where sea and land debate with foam. He built a small cairn, 3 stones, the top one small and flat. He waited. A child came by with his parent and knocked the stones down and threw the top one into the water and laughed. The parent smiled and said sorry, and Graham said don't be and walked back to the car knowing that the pile and the knockdown were both correct. He did not tell anyone about the open browser tab on his laptop nights now, the one with satellite schedules for overhead passes of the Mona Passage, the one that let him imagine a white scratch of a wake moving toward a curve of white chalk under thorn. He did not tell anyone that sometimes, when he closed his eyes, He saw a compass rose not on a floor, but drawn in the air with no hands, and heard the sound of a knife being sharpened on the barrel of a pen, because the body makes the tools it needs when the world has none at hand. When he allowed himself to imagine the cove again, he did not imagine the compass of bones. He imagined the small crown of palm fiber set on the hub of long bones, and whether it had been placed there to honor, to mark, to control, or to invite. He imagined the carved token left heavier in his palm than its weight could account for. He imagined the footprints in the morning, the small ones and the big ones, and the way the wind had tried and failed to be a good eraser. And he asked himself again the question that had no exact format. How do you live in the world after a week when the world practice tested you and discovered a part of you that held, and another part that did not? Far out past the place where the charter had cut its line through the water, a boat ran east to west, and from another boat a fisherman raised a hand, and then did not, and the long shelf of light over the island flashed once, and then did not again, because a ruin does not have to work to remain a ruin. In a shack beneath a gumbo tree, the geckos wrote their punctuation on wood, and a circle of shells lay in the shape wind gave them, and a table waited as tables always wait. And somewhere, because the open ending required a somewhere, a human hand braided fishing line with shells not to say hello or goodbye, but to keep working at the work of making shape out of a place that resists shape, and to leave it where someone who had not asked to be a part of the message might find it, and then spend years deciding whether or not to carry it forward.